A 10-car armored convoy cut through the derelict industrial district like a funeral procession of black steel. Rain lashed against the reinforced glass, blurring the world into shades of grey, oil. In the center of it all sat Ray's Calderon, ruthless, untouchable, and weary of the crown he wore. He moved through the city's veins like a predator, through deep water, a man whose very silhouette caused streets to clear and hearts to stutter. He didn't stop for traffic, and he certainly didn't stop for people. But as the lead SUV's brakes shrieked to a sudden, violent halt, Ray's leaned forward, his sharp features hardening. Through the downpour, a single, small figure stood in the middle of the road, breaking the iron momentum of his empire. Then the world tilted. Ray stepped out of the vehicle, his dark coat heavy with rain, his presence alone a death sentence for any intruder. His bodyguards, Ivo, Dax, and Silas, fanned out like shadows, weapons held in a state of paused aggression. In the center of the mud and the madness stood Leanie Ashford, a girl no older than 7, her messy hair plastered to her forehead, her face a mask of tear-streaked terror. Ray's knelt, an uncharacteristic flicker of pity crossing his intense gaze. But as he reached out, his breath died in his throat. Clutched in the girl's trembling hand was a tattered photograph of a woman Ray's hadn't seen in 20 years. His own sister. But it was the object around the girl's neck that shattered Ray's reality. The Calderon star, a gold locket he had personally placed in a shallow grave 2 decades ago. As he looked up, the air grew colder than the rain. He saw his head bodyguard, Ivo Mercer, shifting, his stance, the silver of a silenced pistol, catching the dim light. In that moment, Ray's realized 3 things. The sister he had mourned was alive. His entire life was a scripted lie, and the men he paid to protect his life were now the ones waiting for the order to end it. The rain came down in sheets, turning the industrial wasteland into a blurred landscape of oil and ash. Ray's remained on one knee, his expensive wool coat soaking up the filth of the gutter as if it were a sponge. His world had narrowed to the size of a tarnished gold locket, the Calderon star, dangling from a frayed ribbon around the girl's neck. He had watched that piece of jewelry disappear into the earth 20 years ago, buried in a shallow grave with the only person he had ever truly loved. Leanie, he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. He reached out, his steady hand trembling for the first time in a decade. Where did you get this? Who gave this to the girl, Antoine Stem? The child didn't speak. Her chest heaved beneath her soaked hoodie, her small frame vibrating with a terror so profound it seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. She clutched the tattered photograph. To her chest, her knuckles white, her tear-streaked face, a mirror of a ghost Ray's had tried to forget. Behind him, the heavy thud of a car door closing signaled the end of the silence. The rhythmic click of boots on wet pavement approached measured, professional, and deadly. Step away from the child, Ray's, a voice commanded. It was Ivo Mercer, his head bodyguard, the man who had stood at Ray's right hand through every war and every mountain of blood. Ray's didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on the locket. She has the star, Ivo. Explain to me how a child in the middle of nowhere is wearing a dead woman's jewelry. The metallic slide of a firearm being readied cut through the roar of the rain. Ray's turned his head slightly, seeing the black muzzle of a silenced pistol leveled not at an invisible enemy, but at the back of Lenny's head. Ivo's expression was a mask of reinforced concrete devoid of hesitation, stripped of loyalty. She's a distraction, boss, Ivo said, his tone as flat as a dial tone. A plant, a stray meant to slow the convoy in a kill zone. I'm moving to neutralize the threat, so we can reach the perimeter. She's a child, Ivo, Ray's growled, rising slowly, his body shifting to shield Lenny from the barrel of the gun. She's a loose end, Ivo Calvo countered, his finger tightening on the trigger. And in this business, loose ends get cut. The click of Ivo's safety being disengaged sounded louder than the thunder rolling over the industrial skyline. Ray's stood fully now, his tall frame a wall of dark wool between the girl and the muzzle of the gun. He had spent 20 years reading men's intentions in the flicker of their pupils, and what he saw in Ivo wasn't tactical caution. It was a frantic, jagged desperation to bury a secret. "You're too eager, Ivo," Ray said, his voice dropping to a low, predatory rumble. "A distraction doesn't carry a locket I buried in the mud 20 years ago. You're not protecting the convoy. You're protecting a lie." Ivo's eyes didn't waver. He didn't look like a bodyguard anymore. He looked like an executioner. "Dax, Silas, secure the perimeter," Ivo barked over the rain. "The boss is compromised." "He's compromised by a ghost." In the background, the other two men shifted. Dax took a half step forward, his hand hovering over his holster, but his face was etched with a sudden, agonizing doubt. Silas remained frozen by the SUV, his eyes darting between the man who signed his checks and the man who led his drills. They were the elite, the Calderon Syndicate's finest, and they were watching their world fracture in real time. "Stand down, Ivo," Reyes commanded, his hand reaching slowly into his own coat. "That is an order from your king." "The king is dead," Ivo countered, his voice rising to cut through the storm. "He died the second he knelt in the dirt for a stray." "Retire the boss. That's an order. Do it now." The hesitation lasted only a heartbeat before the air exploded. Ivo fired first, the silenced puff of his pistol kicking up a plume of mud where Reyes' foot had been a second before. Raised dove, sweeping Leanie into his arms and rolling behind the heavy door of the lead SUV, just as a hail of lead shattered the glass. Chaos swallowed the industrial road. Muzzle flashes strobed through the downpour, lighting up the terrified, wide-eyed face of the girl tucked against Reyes' chest. For 20 years, Reyes Calderon had commanded this army. Now he was their primary target. The subway station smelled of iron, stagnant water, and a decade of abandonment. Reyes slumped against a tiled wall, his lungs burning as the distant echo of sirens and the rhythmic splash of rain faded into the concrete depths above. He kept one hand on his weapon and the other anchored to Leanie's shoulder, feeling the rhythmic tremor that racked her small frame, the flickering emergency. Lights cast long, skeletal shadows across the rusted turnstiles, painting Reyes' face in jagged strips of yellow and black. "We're safe for a moment," he whispered, though the lie tasted like copper in his mouth. He knelt before her, his expensive suit ruined, his hands stained with the grease of the tunnels. "Leanie, look at me. The locket, the woman in the photo. Where are they?" Leanie reached into her oversized hoodie, her fingers shaking as she pulled out the tattered photograph. Her voice was a ghost of a sound, barely rising above the drip of a leaky pipe. "The quiet house," she murmured. "The place with the white bricks and the bars on the windows. Mommy said I had to run when the tall man with the scar fell asleep." Reyes felt the floor drop out from under him. He knew that description. He had built it. The cryption. He had built it. The quiet house was a black site property in the North District. A ghost address, scrubbed from every official ledger. He had used it for years to house witnesses he couldn't kill and enemies he couldn't release. He had entrusted its security to one man, Evo Mercer. "Mommy's always crying," Leanie continued, her eyes searching Reyes with a sudden, heartbreaking hope. "She told me if I found a man who looked like the picture, he'd make the bars go away." Reyes stared at the photo, a younger version of himself, standing beside a girl with a sun-drenched smile. He had spent 20 years believing his sister was ash and memory, a tragedy he used to justify his own cruelty. But as he looked at Leanie, the truth hit him with the force of a physical blow. His empire wasn't a kingdom. It was a prison. A kingdom. It was a prison. And he was the warden who had been tricked into guarding his own family's cage. The flicker of the subway's dying emergency light pulsed like a failing heartbeat, dragging Ray's mind back through 2 decades of darkness. For 20 years, he had lived by a single, jagged rule. Nothing is more dangerous than a man with nothing left to lose. It was Ivo who had taught him that. Ray's remembered the night of the fire at the family estate, the heat of the embers still searing his skin as he dug through the rubble. He remembered Ivo's hand on his shoulder, steady, grounding, and utterly deceptive. "She's gone, Ray's," Ivo had whispered, his voice thick with a counterfeit grief that Ray's had swallowed whole. "There is nothing left but the Empire. Build it. Burn anyone stands in your way. Do it for Fasantes, every cold-blooded execution, every territory expansion, every mountain of illicit wealth had been fueled by that singular, manufactured tragedy. Ivo had been the shadow architect of Ray's soul, carefully tending to the fire of his vengeance like a gardener. Pruning a toxic vine, he had weaponized Ray's grief, turning a grieving brother into a ruthless king who saw empathy as a fatal flaw. While Ray spent years staring at an empty grave in the rain, Ivo had been building the quiet house. He had taken the sister Ray's thought was ash and turned her into a hidden currency. A living insurance policy kept in a basement of bars and silence. Every time Ray's felt a flicker of his old humanity, Ivo would remind him of the death, pulling the strings of his trauma to snap him back into the cold, metallic shape of the boss. Ray's looked at Leanie, the living proof of a 20-year betrayal. Ivo hadn't just been his head of security. He had been his warden, keeping Ray's trapped in a prison of mourning, while the truth lived just a few miles away in a house with white bricks. I was his puppet. Ray's growled into the damp air of the station, his knuckles cracking as he gripped his weapon. He hadn't been building a legacy. He had been building a monument to a lie. And Ivo, Mercer, was the one who held the keys to the kingdom, and the cage. The neon sign of the rusty anchor hummed with a sick, rhythmic buzz, casting a jaundiced light over the man sitting in the furthest booth. Elias Thorne had once been the city's golden boy of the Major Crimes Unit, until Ray's Calderon had systematically dismantled his life, his career, and his dignity. Now, Thorne was a ghost in a stained trench coat, nursing a drink that smelled like industrial cleaner. Ray stepped out of the shadows, the wet wool of his coat dripping onto the sawdust floor. Leanie stayed tucked behind him, her small hand gripping the fabric of his trousers. Thorne didn't look up, but his hand tightened around his glove. "I spent 3 years wishing you'd walk through a door so I could put a bullet in your heart," Ray's Thorne rasped, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "Seeing you like this, soaked, hunted, and dragging a kid through the mud, is almost better." "I need a ghost car," Thorne, Ray said, his voice a low, jagged blade. "Untraceable keys, a burner with a scrambled signal, and the layout for the North District black site." "Now," Thorne let out a dry, hacking laugh. "You ruined me for less than that. Why should I help the man who turned my badge into a punchline?" Ray's didn't blink. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a single, encrypted titanium drive. He slid it across the scarred wood of the table. "That drive contains the routing numbers for my offshore holdings in Macau and the Cayman Islands. Every cent I've laundered, every drop of blood I've turned into gold. It's more money than you've seen in 3 lifetimes. It's yours." Thorne stared at the drive, the light of the neon sign reflecting off the metal. "You're giving up the crown for a girl and a memory." "Huh?" "I'm buying back the 20 years I lost to a liar," Ray's countered. The detective reached out, his fingers trembling as he snatched the drive. He reached into his coat and produced a heavy set of keys and a plastic-wrapped phone. "The car is in the alley behind the cannery. It's a nondescript grey sedan stolen from a scrapyard. No VIN, no history. Just like you, Ray's." Ray's took the keys, the weight of them a cold promise. He didn't thank the man he had broken. He simply turned and vanished back into the rain. A king who had just traded his kingdom for a chance to, Isha, Verza. The shipping yard was a cathedral of rusting steel and salt air, where towering containers stacked 4 high created a labyrinth of narrow, sunless canyons. Rain drummed against the corrugation tautened, a deafening percussion that masked the sound of Ray's heavy breathing. He felt the vibration of Leni's small hand in his. Her eyes wide as she looked up at the giants hunting them. Stay small, Lenini, Ray's whispered, his voice a low vibration, like a mouse. Follow the shadows through the gaps. Don't stop until I whistle. A crimson laser sight cut through the gloom, dancing across the metal inches from Ray's shoulder. Dax and Silas were moving with tactical precision. Dax, the butcher, heavy and relentless. Silas, the ghost who never missed. They weren't bodyguards anymore. They were the clean-up crew for a kingdom Ray's had already burned. Ray's watched Leni slip into a gap between 2 containers, a space barely 6 inches wide. Impossible for a grown man in tactical gear to navigate. He waited until she disappeared before he slammed. His fist against a hollow steel wall, the booming echo, ringing through the yard like a bell. Dax was the first to round the corner, his rifle leveled, but Ray's was already above him, using the narrow alley Leni had pointed out. Ray's had scaled a rusted ladder, dropping like a shadow onto the butcher's back. The struggle was short and brutal, a knife glinting in the dark, a choked gasp, and then silence as the heavy man slumped into the mud. Dax, report. Silas's voice crackled over the comms. Coming from the north. Ray's didn't answer. He moved through the maze, guided by the soft scuff of Leni's sneakers ahead of him. She was his scout, leading him through the blind spots where the massive guards couldn't turn their weapons. When Silas finally emerged into a clearing of stacked crates, he found only an empty hoodie draped over a barrel. He turned, but Ray's was already there, emerging from the gap Leni had cleared. The king of the syndicate didn't use a gun. He used a gun. He used the very environment he had spent years mastering. With a single, fluid strike, Silas was down. Ray stood over his former elite, the rain washing, the blood from his knuckles. He wasn't a boss anymore. He was a predator, protecting his own. The quiet house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac of broken glass and dead dreams, its white brick exterior glowing like a bleached bone under the flickering street lamps. To any passerby, abandoned clinic, a relic of a forgotten era. To Ray's, it was a blueprint etched into the back of his eyelids. He had spent millions ensuring this perimeter was a digital fortress, a web of pressure, plates, thermal sensors, and silent alarms that could summon a strike team in under 3 minutes. Leni stood beside him, her small hand trembling as she stared at the heavy iron door. The bad men live there, she whispered, her voice nearly lost to the wind. Not for long, Ray's replied, his voice a low, jagged rasp. He didn't move like a conqueror. He moved like a ghost. He knelt by an unremarkable junction box hidden behind a rusted HVAC unit, his fingers dancing over a keypad he had designed to be unhackable. He wasn't breaking in. He was whispering to the house in a language only its creator knew, with a sharp click and the hiss of disengaging pneumatics. The primary security grid went dark. The red eye of the overhead camera blinked once and died. It was a surreal, sickening irony. The very systems he had built to protect his secrets were now the only thing standing between him and the truth. As he pushed the heavy door open, the scent of ozone and antiseptic washed over him. He moved through the sterilized hallways, his boots making no sound on the polished linoleum. Every corner he turned, every biometric scanner he bypassed with a master override code felt like a betrayal of counterfeit. Horrorstone. He had spent a lifetime building walls to keep the world out, only to realize he had been the one trapped on the outside, all along. He was a thief in his own palace, a king raiding his own treasury, hunting for the one thing gold couldn't buy. As he reached the final reinforced door at the end of the basement corridor, his hand hesitated on the handle. For 20 years, he had been the architect of this silence now. He was about to break it. He was about to break it forever. The air in the basement was thick with the hum of servers and the sterile scent of a hospital wing. Reyes pushed the final door open, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. There, beneath the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, sat a woman whose face was a map of the grief he had carried for 20 years. She was pale, her hair streaked with premature grey, but her eyes wide and amber were unmistakably his. Elena. He breathed the name a jagged prayer. She looked up, her lips trembling, but before she could speak, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room. Ivo Mercer stepped into the light, his tailored suit uncreased, his expression as cold as a winter grave. In his right hand, he held a sleek, black detonator. A touching reunion. Reyes, truly, Ivo said. His voice a smooth, oily caress, but don't get too close. This building is wired with enough C4 to turn this entire block into a crater, one thumb press. And the ghost stays a ghost forever. Reyes froze. His body coiled like a spring, his gaze darting between his sister and the man he had trusted with his life. You've had her here for 2 decades, Afor. You've had Ivo. Because a grieving king is a focused king, Ivo countered. And because I knew the day would come when you'd grow tired of the crown, you want them to walk out of here. You want Leni to have a mother? Then, give me the master key. Keys, the digital vaults, the routing codes, the entire Calderon infrastructure. Hand over the keys to the city. Raise and disappear. Become the nobody you should have been 20 years ago. The silence in the room was absolute. Absolute, broken only by Elena's ragged breathing. Reyes looked at the detonator, then at the sister who had been his North Star, and finally at Leni, who was huddled by the door. The empire he had built was a mountain of blood and bone, a digital fortress that controlled the pulse of the city. To hand it to Ivo was to hand a monster the world. To refuse was to watch his family burn. The keys, Reyes, Ivo prompted, his thumb hovering over the red button. Decide. Is the empire worth their lives? The silence in the basement was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against Reyes' lungs. Ivo stood like a monument to greed, his thumb poised over the detonator, his eyes alight with the reflected glow of the server racks. He was a man who believed power was a bank account, a digital ledger of stolen lives and laundered gold. The keys, Reyes, Ivo repeated, his voice a jagged edge of impatience. Give me the empire, or I'll bury you all in its foundations. Reyes didn't blink. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, unassuming transmitter. Not the master keys, but the Black Swan protocol he had designed for the day the walls finally closed in. It was the ultimate fail-safe, a scorched earth virus designed to overwrite every server, every offshore account, and every encrypted vault in the Calderon network with a string of zeros. You want the empire, Ivo? Reyes' voice was a low, terrifying rumble. Then take it. But a king is nothing without his gold. Before Ivo could react, Reyes slammed his thumb onto the transmitter. Across the room, the server lights turned a violent, screaming red. On Ivo's tablet, the billions of dollars in the syndicate's financial network began to bleed away, digits vanishing into a digital abyss. In 10 seconds, the Calderon syndicate wasn't just broke, it ceased to exist. Ivo's face went ash-grey, his hand trembling as he stared at the screen. The detonator was still in his hand, but the leverage was gone. To kill Reyes now was to kill the only man who knew where the physical bodies were buried. And without the money, Ivo was just a man with a gun in a room full of ghosts. He looked up, his eyes wide with a sudden, panicked realization that he was now the hunted one. Ray's didn't wait for the explosion that never came. He reached out, his hand finally closing around Elena's, and scooped Leanie into his other arm. He walked past Ivo, the shadow architect now. A shivering wreck among the dying servers, they stepped out of the quiet house just as the first bruised purple of dawn broke over the horizon. The rain had stopped. Ray's paused at the edge of the cul-de-sac, peeling off his heavy, blood-stained wool coat and dropping it into the mud. He stood in his shirt sleeves, the cold morning air a baptism. As the sun rose, the man who had been a Mafia boss began the long walk home, no longer a king, but finally a brother. Did Ray's make the right choice burning his empire for his family? Tell us your country and how this ending made you feel. If you enjoyed this journey of betrayal and redemption, like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends to see what happens next.